Hello, everyone. I want to welcome all public that join us today for the book presentation of Arab Worlds Beyond the Middle East and North Africa. My name is Marlise Viesca, and I'm the Executive Director of the Foro del Sur Foundation, an Argentine think tank for international affairs that was created 25 years ago. You can follow us, this event you can follow through also our YouTube channel. Also, we encourage everyone to turn off your cameras and microphones until the questions and answers sections begin. I'd like to thank you very much, ASPA Institute as a partner, as well as our sponsors, the digital interpreter, ALADA Chile, ALADA International, and Middle East and North Africa Work Group of CLACSO. And now I'm pleased to introduce the moderator for this section, Jorge Araneda, THEC International Relations of Middle East from Ankara University. Jorge.
Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you all to our current event hosted by our Foro del Sur Foundation and ASPA Institute. I want to repeat my gratitude with the organization and sponsor institute for inviting me to moderate this great event and book. I would like to invite you all to follow us in our social media, where you can find more article information about the current event and the future events organized by Foro del Sur and ASPA Institute. Furthermore, it is my privilege to introduce our guest speaker today. First of all, Mariana Hassemi is an assistant professor of Robertson School of Media and Culture at the Virginia Commonwealth University. He has served as the Carney Fellow at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and is a research fellow of London School of Economics. As well to Claudia Joaquim, who is a Deputy Director of Knowledge Management and Research in the Center of Inclusive Business and Leadership in the Oldham School of Business and at the American University of Beirut. As well as with us is Diogo Versito, and a PhD candidate at Georgetown University and worker at the Jerusalem-based foreign correspondent of Folha de Sao Paulo, and the author of his book, Brimos. Last but not least is our Hador Khalil, Master in the American University in Cairo, founder and director of the Interprete Digital, and founder member as well of ASPA Institute. Today's event is expected to last 1 hour and a half, and this is the format that we will follow. First, I will try to pose some leading questions to our guests, and second, I will take some inquiries in the audience. In order to be respectful with the speaker and everyone here present today, attendance will be muted during the presentation. Then, attendant may submit questions at any time during the session through our Q&A box. Please feel free to share your name, institution affiliation, and location. Now, it's going to give me a great pleasure to give the word first to our guest, Diogo Versito, and then to our second guest that I will follow the session, who will share his insight of the book, but particularly, as well as Hador Khalil, will present the context of his own chapter. Furthermore, I will to thank you again to our PhD candidate, Diogo Versito, and I will start to ask this question after read your quite interesting chapter. In your chapter, you agree there is a political overrepresentation of the Lebanese community. Can you elaborate better and explain as well how this happened? Later, I will try to, you're insightful in terms of what is the political real impact of this overrepresented Lebanese community? Doesn't this Arab lobby, or what's that, affect the domestic and foreign affairs?
Right. Thank you, Jorge. Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to speak about this book, and particularly about my chapter. Before I answer your question on this, what I call in my chapter, the overrepresentation of the Lebanese community in the politics of Brazil, I just want to clarify what I mean by that, what I mean by overrepresentation. I mean it in two senses, I guess, both in quantity and quality. Both in the number of politicians, that is, and the kind of position they occupy in Brazil. And that is very disproportional if we take the number of actual Lebanese people and their descendants in Brazil. Of course, the problem here is that we don't know for sure how many people of Lebanese descent live in Brazil. So it's quite hard, to tell how much overrepresented this community is. But I'll try to give you the closest idea that I can give. So, according to the Brazilian and to the Lebanese government, that's kind of the official statistics that we have. There are between 7 million and 10 million people of Lebanese descent in Brazil. Of course, we know, and that's undisputable, that the Lebanese community of Brazil is the largest outside of Lebanon. That's out of question. But again, that's just an estimate. We don't know how the Brazilian government got to that figure. My hunch is that this is a projection based on numbers that were published in the 80s, but we don't know exactly where that comes. So it's very hard to judge those numbers by themselves, right? So my personal belief, and that of most scholars, I think, is that this is a quite exaggerated number, that the number is quite lower than that. Although, again, I cannot say how much lower that is. And the problem is that we just don't have reliable sources. So when Lebanese migrants started going to Brazil in the end of the 19th century, of course, there was no Lebanon per se. There was no political entity called Lebanon, right? So they would be classified in the port of Santos. When they got to Brazil, they would be counted as Turks. They would be counted as Asians, Asians, Syrians. The official category of Lebanese in terms of migration to Brazil just exists in the 40s, right? So we just can't know, basically. There is no way of knowing how many people that were coming from what we later called Lebanon went to Brazil, right? So we have some other estimates. There are scholars that are saying that, something between 100,000 and 150,000 people from the Middle East in general migrated to Brazil from the 1870s onwards. But those are, again, just estimates. But even if you take that number, that official number, let's say, of 7 million people of Lebanese descent in Brazil, which, again, I think it's an exaggeration, that would only represent 3% of the Brazilian population. But if we look at the number of politicians of Lebanese descent in the Brazilian Congress, the number is much higher. So again, that's what I mean by overrepresentation. And the way that I measure that in the chapter is through something called the Grupo Parlamentar Brasil-Líbano, which is the Lebanese caucus in the Brazilian parliament. And if we look at the last mandate that lasted from 2015 to 2019, they had 35 members, which in the whole Brazilian Congress would mean that they represent 6% of the Congress. So it's, in that very rough approximation, that's twice the percentage of Lebanese people represented in a larger population. So again, that's what I mean by a disproportional proportion, but that's in terms of quantity. And again, this is very hard to estimate, but I'm also interested in the quality in terms of which kind of positions these people from Lebanese descent are occupying in Brazil. And of course, I guess that most of you know that the former president of Brazil, Michel Temer, is the son of migrants. His parents migrated from Ta'abura. It's a village in Cura in the north of Lebanon. In São Paulo, both city and state, we have a lot of high-profile names. We had someone called Paulo Maluf, for instance, who was both mayor and governor of São Paulo. We had a mayor called Fernando Haddad, as well, obviously from Lebanese descent. We had Gilberto Kassab, also from Lebanese descent. Last elections for the city of São Paulo, one of the main contenders was Guilherme Boulos, also the son of Lebanese migrants. So that's to give an idea of what kind of position we're talking about, very high profile position. And I'm sorry I'm taking too long to answer your question. I just wanted to give kind of a context to what I'm saying and kind of explaining the frameworks of my chapter. And I'll finally go into your question on how that happened. There are a lot of explanations, and I'm borrowing a lot from Oswaldo Truzzi, who is a very influential sociologist in Brazil. He wrote what is perhaps the best book on Syrian and Lebanese migration to Brazil in '97. And he presents us several ideas of how that happened. The first is that Lebanese migrants invested in education much more than other ethnic groups in Brazil. So comparing with Italians or Spaniards or Germans, Lebanese were investing a lot of money and a lot of social capital in education, which is very important because the first waves of politicians of Lebanese descent come from the law schools, basically from the law school of São Paulo, Largo São Francisco. So yes, education. Then you have to think of the general political context. In the 30s, the dictator of Brazil, Getúlio Vargas, was kind of courting ethnic minorities. It was recruiting a lot of ethnic minorities to counterbalance the old oligarchies of São Paulo. So it was a very good timing for you as a descendant of Lebanese migrants or a migrant yourself to get into politics. There was a lot of openings. And also the last thing I will mention is that Arab migrants mostly worked as peddlers in the beginning of the century. Of course, it's not everyone, but it was the work of choice in that period. And that meant that they were spread throughout the whole territory. They could represent different constituencies. So that also helps explain kind of this overrepresentation. Because I mean, I was just talking about national politics and the case of São Paulo, but we also have politicians of Arab descent in the whole country. So it's, I think those are perhaps the main explanations that I would flesh out.
I think it's quite interesting the evolution, like the dynamics inside and outside the community, like how the community invests in themselves for one part, regarding to the real number in terms of population, but as well how they use the machinery of the state and how the state play a role trying to use this migrant, and the migrant use as well this role for themselves. Like it's two-way road. But for that reason, I was trying to in the second question, trying to like go more deeply in your chapter. How this Arab lobby impacts or affect the domestic and foreign policies regarding to this vis-a-vis interchange with the states?
Thank you, Jorge. That's actually a great question, and it's something that people ask me a lot. And I guess the answer is very complex. And I'm not sure I have a definite answer, but mostly because I don't want to generalize too much, but I have some ideas of that. First, yes, I do think that we have several examples of how this overrepresented community impacted domestic and foreign policies. In these, I may be disagreeing with previous studies. We had a lot of scholars that argued that there was no impact. I do believe that there is some impact, and I discuss some examples on my chapter. I think one of the interesting examples that I give on the chapter is the kind of local legislation that the Syrian and Lebanese community pushed for in some places. For instance, in São Paulo, there were a lot of local laws creating, for instance, squares or streets in the city, kind of paying homage to the Syrian and Lebanese community. So we have, for instance, Marja Ayoun Square in São Paulo. We have Salim Al-Baid Square. We have Islam Square, Syrian Square. We had proposals from lawmakers trying to create national days to celebrate Syrian independence in the 40s or Lebanese independence. So there are a lot of law proposals coming from that sense, kind of very small legislative measures, but very telling in a way. Secondly, something that seems very important to me is how the Lebanese or Syrian or Arab origin of some of these politicians played a central role in their trajectories. And I think the best example for that is Paulo Maluf. So Paulo Maluf is probably one of the most famous politicians in Brazil. He's the son of Salim Farah Maluf, who migrates to Brazil in the beginning of the 20th century. And Paulo Maluf, as I said before, he was mayor of São Paulo, he was governor of São Paulo, he ran for president. But throughout all this time, I mean, throughout the decades from the 70s when he started his most high-profile career, the kind of Levantine origin that he had kind of hindered his career. So for instance, when he was considered for the position of mayor of São Paulo under the dictatorship, the publisher of the main newspaper of São Paulo at the time, Estado de São Paulo, he supposedly said that the city could never be ruled by someone who is Kibe, which is the title of my chapter because of that. There is also a story of a former general under the military dictatorship saying that the country could never be ruled by a Turk, which is also how they called Maluf. And Maluf's case is also interesting, I think, because he's an example of how someone could actually turn that upside down and frame a narrative of a successful Lebanese. So I think that's also very interesting how being Lebanese and being Arab actually worked in his favor, perhaps after the 80s and the 90s when Brazil went through the democratic transition. But that's regarding domestic policy. Regarding foreign policy, it's again very complex and it's very debatable, but I also present some interesting cases on my chapter. The first one, and perhaps the most interesting, is this diplomatic cable that I discovered that was written in the American consulate in 2006, if I'm not mistaken. Basically, American diplomats were trying to investigate the presence of, they were trying to ask the question if the presence of so many Arabs in Brazil explained Brazilian policies towards the Middle East. So they just noticed that Brazil had been lobbying, for instance, to the creation of the Palestinian state, well, the recognition of the Palestinian state. And they were trying to understand if the leftist government of Lula da Silva at that period was under the influence of the Arab community. So that's kind of the research question that the American consulate had. And then they interviewed some people. They didn't do a very extensive research, but they reached the conclusion that no, that because the Arab community was so divided, they could never exert any kind of pressure or any kind of influence. I disagree with that. Of course, I agree that the Arab community is divided. And of course, we have politicians from the far right to the far left. We have, Michel Temer is very different from Fernando Haddad, who is very different from Ma'alouf, Kassab. They all represent different parts of the spectrum. Of course, the community is divided. Of course, there is no kind of centralized lobby or ethnic interest. I'm not saying that. But I do think that we have instances in which being Arab or being Muslim actually made difference in Brazilian foreign policy. And the example that I think that I give on the chapter is that 2 or 3 years ago, when President Jair Bolsonaro wanted to transfer the Brazilian embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, in that moment, the Arab League threatened to boycott Brazilian meat exports because Brazil is one of the main exporters of halal meat, both chicken and meat. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, for instance, are big buyers of Brazilian food. So basically, the Arab League was saying that, we're going to boycott your exports if you actually move the embassy. And in that moment, the halal market in Brazil, represented by FAMBRAS, which is the umbrella that congregates Muslim associations in Brazil, they started lobbying with the government, they started meeting with the president and his aides, and in the end, the embassy was never transferred. What I'm trying to say is that I think that in that moment, it's perhaps not official politics, but there was some sort of lobby coming from the Arab and the Muslim community in Brazil impacting foreign policy. So that's the example that I thought of bringing up. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, for sure. I think it's quite interesting chapter for reading and for trying to understand how this influential or lobby can affect the state in some particular case, and in other cases is just another group of just one among others, a group of pressure. Thank you so much, Versito, for your explanation. I think that this discussion activate the chat, maybe we will return to you with another question regarding to the overrepresentation and this kind of issue regarding to the Lebanese community inside of Brazil. Now I would like to welcome again to Professor Claudia Joaquim. I hope he's there. She's the Deputy Director of Knowledge Management and Research and the Center of Inclusive Business and Leadership of Olaham School of Business and the American University of Beirut. Thank you to be here. I was very, very interesting in the book. I will try to address some questions that must be quite challenging in terms of like put together this work. The first one is, what is the challenge of engage in this kind of project that highlight the transnational identities in the Arab diaspora outside of MENA region that is more common in type of the researchers?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question, and thanks for having this, for putting on this event, to all the organizers and to all the panelists and everyone attending. I think that's a really interesting question. When we think about, and Miriam will go a little bit more into this, I think, with in terms of the book and our collaboration. But when we think about immigrant communities, home, like having a transnational identity and home, is a very complicated subject for people, especially when they immigrate from one nation to another. So immigrant communities have to kind of reimagine and recreate what home is, in terms of, you know, in large part, which is driven by having a familiar community, ethnic and linguistic familiarity, and even having a sense of national belonging. So all of this is in question through the immigration process, as we know. And throughout this book, home is something that we see is defined and redefined through personal, through political, and through social constructs that are rooted in ancestral ties to the MENA region, and specifically to nation states in which immigrants are coming from. So when we think of transnational identities, we see that the most, like generally in the chapters and beyond, when we think about immigrant communities, we see that transnational identities are most pronounced in either for the immigrant population, which is the first generation, or their children, so the second generation. But we see also that with each generation, these ethnic markers, and some of our authors highlight this, that with these ethnic markers, such as accent or wardrobe or ancestral and cultural adaptation, become a little bit more ambiguous over time, over generations. So over time, we see that immigrants try to hold on, or immigrant communities or children of immigrants, they try to hold on to one's culture, their ancestral identity, like speaking a language that is of the parents or grandparents, but it becomes more difficult over time. And the more that one is immersed in their host society or their new nation state, we see a little bit of a challenge in maintaining that. What we also see, though, is that through ancestral homeland, if a group is able to visit family abroad, or if they can travel more freely, if they have more movement that between their host and home nation states, if they are not restricted, that is, in movement, then ethnic and cultural ties can be more likely to be maintained. In other ways are through ethnic enclaves, where there's an influx of immigrants who also maintain this kind of ethnic and cultural identity quite a bit within that space. So I think with the challenge in engaging in a project like this that highlights these transnational identities is trying to include as many of these transnational trajectories as possible from the MENA to other parts of the world, which was really difficult. We were aiming to point to the diversity of the MENA region, and at the same time to capture variations in the movement. So when we say things like the Arab diaspora, or when we say like the MENA region, or if we refer to a specific Arab country, we wanted to highlight especially that, you know, these are dynamic, the regions are dynamic, the countries are dynamic, so are people and places. You know, there's a very rich diversity in the region and within each nation state. Even the patterns of the trajectory of immigration, even within one nation state, is vastly different depending on if you're, you know, in one neighborhood or the other. Of course, some push factors might be the same, but some pull factors might be different if you know someone somewhere else, or if you have family already, you know, in another nation. So even within one country, there's these multiple kind of patterns, which we thought was really interesting. For the book, we didn't want to limit our authors. So in terms of exploration, we didn't set a limit to what years we wanted to explore in terms of immigration, or what generation, you know, we wanted them to investigate, for instance. So we left that up to the authors. And, you know, we were pleasantly surprised with a good number of chapters for the submission. And unfortunately, we even had to turn some chapters away. But the experience of reading through these many chapters made us even more confident that the work is not only important, it's timely, and it's necessary to break the monolith that people think about when they think of Arabs, or when they think of the Middle East and North Africa, you know, like kind of unpacking what that means. So we wanted to bring as much nuance as possible to Arab and Muslim communities in various cities, in various countries, in various time periods. So we left it up to the authors of the book to decide, like, framework of immigration, settlement, and settlement, as some chapters highlight more settlement than the history of the immigration pattern.
This is quite interesting. Several researchers, when they study diaspora migration or diaspora subjects or Magyar migrants in South America, or particularly in North America, they are always dealing with this complexity of different layers between generation, language, original country, different approach. For that reason, my second question will be, there is an increasing interest in study these complex subjects. How this book address this dealing that with the interdisciplinarity approach that from the university as well and the academic space say, okay, this is the best way to do it, but it's a challenge in some ways as well.
Yeah. I don't know if there's a best way to do it. I think there's just different ways that people can approach it. I don't know that we're the blueprint, but I think the study of, first I want to say that I think academics, we tend to kind of be in silos, like in one department, we don't branch out too much. So we kind of wanted to also break that. But the study of ethno-religious identity and immigration, you know, they're complex in their own right. I don't think Arab subjects are like more or less complex than any other ethnic group. You know, we're just as complex as other ethnic groups. There's no exceptionalism here. So I strongly feel that having various experts to speak on the subject of Arab immigration allows us as academics to branch out, and it allows us to collaborate with each other academics in the academy and outside of the academy. So our authors actually come with different backgrounds. From social sciences, we have historians, sociologists, political scientists, communication professors, and we have non-academic professionals who are leaders in government that equally bring a plethora of knowledge and expertise to this work. And although each chapter does stand alone, they're a collection that really add a, you know, they all have one broad theme, and the theme is we focus on Arab immigration to different parts of the world. So, which, you know, this is quite effective in helping the reader to think about ideas and concepts across the chapters. So someone can read about, you know, the history of, you know, Palestinians immigration to Latin America, and at the same time, you know, have appreciation for what the Arabs in Latin America and other spaces, like, we were talking about earlier with Lebanese in Brazil, for example. So you get these kind of like the different framings depending on one's expertise, but you also get to kind of compare and contrast like ideologies and theoretical frameworks, which is nice. So while the work covers immigration trajectories of Arabs, it also it does highlight settlement patterns, which is it's quite challenging in its own right in terms of adjustment for immigrant communities. But and it also takes into account the different social, political, and economic realities and encounters in addition to that. So part of the interdisciplinary approach, and I really wanted to highlight her work because I appreciate this component to what we wanted to reach as, how interdisciplinary did we really want to be? And I wanted to highlight the artist whose art is on the cover of our book. Her name is Maina Deeb. I don't know if you have the book, but I'm gonna pick it up and just show you. So this is the artist, and her name is Maina Deeb, Manaldeeb. She's an incredible Palestinian artist and part of the Diaspora. And her work is actually displayed in the Palestinian Museum in the United States. During a brief interview with Manal, I was asking her about her art and her inspiration for her art. And she referred to her art as where her heart is. And I thought that was just a really interesting perspective from an artist. If you actually give Manal's art a closer look, what you'll see is that her work is actually an extension of how she keeps Palestine alive, regardless of where she's living. And that's why she's depicting her art in this way, which I think is really powerful. And definitely check out her work if you haven't. She's just incredible. But in her art, she also, these powerful pictures that she has of, she'll have like people, like powerful pictures of people as silhouettes. And then as the background of the silhouette will be like Jerusalem, which is on their mind, or a pre-1948 map of Palestine drawn on their mind. And I think this is it's symbolic. And I think it speaks to a lot of immigrant communities, like first generation Palestinians, who are also my parents. I'm a child of Palestinian immigrants. I'm Palestinian American, but it made me think about, when people are, forced to flee, and in this case, due to occupation, there's kind of like a longing for Palestine. There's a longing for, and the strong connection that we consider, if we consider like the conditional acceptance of Palestinians in a lot of places in the world. And then you see in the chapters, it's a little bit of a different narrative, if you will, of in a chapter by Michael Paulberg titled Turcos and Chilistinos, which I think is really interesting and witty way of meshing the identity of Palestinians in Chile. But he's talking about the chapters, the title is Latin American Palestinian Diaspora Nationalism in a Comparative Context. And what he explains is that, there are many Palestinians in Latin America. The majority of Palestinians reside in El Salvador, Honduras, and Chile, with Chile actually having a very politically active Palestinian nationalist movement. And then he goes on to explain that the political and occupational heterogeneity of Palestinians in Chile actually supported their social and political success, which is kind of like in stark contrast of how you usually read about Palestinians and Palestinian identity and their acceptance and their in the way that they might not be, there might be a lot of challenges in terms of politicizing their identity and in terms of their acculturation process. So I just think for readers and from a reader's point of view, And I suppose from a co-editor's point of view as well, this made me consider just like the sharp contrast that someone can consider when reading an interdisciplinary book, you know, just kind of giving a little bit more of a dimension or more of a perspective, given these kind of outlooks.
Yes, it's quite interesting, particularly because as a Chilean who work a lot in researchers with the Palestinian Arab community, I can see it, but as well is quite surprised that the engagement with interdisciplinary approach that the book bring to us, particularly for the students, that this can be done. It's a lot of work, as any book, but bring more information and more nuances about the migration, the diaspora, and these topics. In that regard, I would like to present again to our third guest, Dr. Marianne Al-Hazemi is with us. I hope that is with us. Marianne Al-Hazemi is assistant professor of Robertson School of Media and Culture in Virginia Commonwealth University. She has served as a Carney Fellow in the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and a research fellow at the London School of Economics. Hello, Professor.
Hello.
Hello, Professor. How are you? Thank you for being here. We was discussing these enormous and so complex and beautiful as well books. And for that reason, I want to ask like something appeared very simple, but maybe the answer is more complex, is what was the motivation? What was it behind of editing the Arab world beyond the Middle East and North Africa? And in your mind, previous to this editorial process or the finish of this book, did you achieve the purpose was in your mind previously?
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us. It's wonderful to be here and have the opportunity. Actually, this is my first time seeing some of the authors in the book. So this is a really wonderful opportunity. And I just want to say thank you to everyone, the organizers, the panelists. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be able to discuss this book with you. So to begin with, when we're talking about motivation, motivation is a very personal thing. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to talk a little bit about personal ideas. So first of all, I'd like to talk about my professional training as a person, right? So I'm a communications scholar and I focus primarily on international communication. And I think it really makes sense. You know, I grew up, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, which is my country, my background, really affected my upbringing. And so I became extremely interested in international news at a young age, and especially anything related to the Middle East. And so when I met Claudia, I found out she was studying ethnic studies, and I was just very surprised because I'd never thought about ethnic studies as something that you can study. But the interesting thing is about our two fields is that they intersect. So anytime there is international conflict, media coverage of race comes up, and it did earlier this summer with Arab communities around the world and protests and so forth. And so there's really a lot of overlap, I think, between really understanding what the communities are like and then understanding how the media coverage of these communities are different, right? And so that's kind of the cool thing about our two areas and our two backgrounds. And like many studies, this or many projects, many academic scholarship, there was very informal roots to our book. Like I actually remember we were just graduate students finishing off our PhDs, having conversations about all the things we were reading and whether or not they reflected what we saw firsthand, whether it was through stories of people we had met or when traveling, we started to notice that there's a serious gap between all these people telling us about their family histories and family stories. You know, I met a really cool medical doctor who was Mexican, and he came from the Arab world, and you know, it's so cool to talk to different people and to realize, wait, like, why haven't I read about this? Why is it so difficult to get this information? And so when we were still doctoral students, just about to finish our dissertation, you know, we said, one day we're going to write about this. And, you know, then we moved off, we went different directions in our lives. And so that's really the motivation was to build something that is more holistic in terms of the disciplinary overlap, and also more inclusive of different world regions, right? So here, you know, like even in a community level, sometimes we forget when we're in Virginia that there are Arab communities in like Tennessee, right? So like this is a kind of a we wanted to shy away from this. And then in terms of satisfaction, you know, you're asking me a really hard question because I'm not an easily satisfied person. but I would say to begin with that our effort was by no means exhaustive. So just because we get this book done doesn't mean that it's the only truth in the world and everything else is wrong, or that it's complete and there's nothing else that needs to be done. We mentioned this in the book while we were writing the book, while we were finding different authors. We actually came across a lot of the literature, particularly from the 1990s, on Arab communities in both the West and East coasts of Africa. And, you know, we emailed several anthropologists who specialize in these communities, and everybody was busy working on another chapter for another book. And so we couldn't really, we couldn't cover that. And that's a shortcoming of the book. But one of the things that we did try to do, we tried to, and I think this is kind of mentioned already, but I want to emphasize that one of the cool things about being a graduate student working on a doctorate is that you see the opportunities, everything that you don't like, you want to be better than that, you want to produce something different. And that's, I think, the biggest achievement of Claudia and I, is that, number one, we're different people, we have different family backgrounds, we have different personalities, we have different approaches to academic literature, to the academy itself. And one of the things that we both saw firsthand is that we both benefited from the other person's perspective. And we also wanted to benefit from the perspectives of people who are in different world regions, and of people who've been trained to deal with different kinds of questions than ourselves. And so that's the really cool thing. And you know, the other thing that you'll notice in the book is it deals with individual level issues, like how people feel about their identities as they're moving from one country to the other. But it also deals with cultural level variables, like how are these TV shows in Germany affecting the assimilation process for kids coming in. So it's in that way, I have a sense of satisfaction in that it's a well-rounded project. It's a little bit different than maybe some other books that you'll see, because it incorporates lots of different perspectives and disciplines. And that really was one of our goals from the start. And so that was, I hope that's maybe a long answer, but that's the answer to the questions. Thank you.
Yes, for sure. I think that, and I agree completely, that there is a gap in the literature today regarding to this, and Professor Joaquim as well present that these different gaps, these different layers that need to be addressed, particularly that, for example, in South America, when we need to trying to understand the different perspective and the different life or the communities very close to each other, for example, the Lebanese, but the Muslim, but that the media treat them like quite different. And that is quite, I think the book presents very well. But in that regard, I will try to put you a little bit more, Professor, if you allow me. And what was the gap in the literature about the Arab diaspora and its dynamic identity outside the MENA region that nor you as well, the authors, trying to feel it in this book, that you feel that wasn't there and the book trying to address?
Okay, thank you. So again, my answers might be a little bit personal in nature, and I have both. I have two kind of approaches to answering this question. And I'm going to begin by maybe the more objective way of looking at your question. So the gap in literature is that, you know, I think sometimes when we're reading about Arab communities, sometimes people use nationalities of people where they originate from, whether they're Syrian or Lebanese or Palestinian community. But there's also like another way to think about it, which is that there is an Arab community in Argentina and in Singapore, and in some places these communities they still exist, and in some places like Cuba, the Arab community doesn't really have a big presence there anymore. And so, you know, in the United States, people assimilate, and sometimes they lose touch of their roots over time. And so every community is really different, and sometimes that has to do with the host society itself. And sometimes it has to do with the home society and why people are leaving, you know, whether it's a forced migration or not. So there's lots of different factors. Now, in this particular chapter, again, I'm going to refer back to the fact that, you know, we covered a lot of different countries. So there are 4 chapters, like there's, you know, that deal with Latin America, but there are also some that deal with Europe, like France and Germany. There are some chapters that deal about like the pain of children that have to grow up reconciling their different cultural identities in a new land. There's a chapter about gender roles and how that changes when people migrate from one culture to the other. So each chapter has its own emphasis, whether it's based on like which factor we're thinking about or where they're located. And I think that the fact that there is that kind of holistic view, that's really been missing so far. And it makes sense. I think like when you hyper focus on one community, you can come in with a lot more detail than our book really covers for any one particular place. But it's really like we're really proud of bringing people together, not just based on where they're located or what they're studying, like in terms of which question they're studying, but also that these people have different professional backgrounds. Like it's not even limited just to academics. We have 2 career diplomats who worked on this book. So the chapter, there's 2 different chapters where we had at least one author who was not entirely an academic. And that's something that, you know, there's a lot of criticisms of academia that it's like too closed off. It doesn't interact with the real world. And so that was our attempt to kind of bridge that gap. In terms of the more personal answer to your question, what are we trying to do with this book in terms of filling a gap? To be completely honest, when I have a problem, the first thing I do is go to the library and read about it. And there are generations of Arabs going to libraries and not finding books that reflect their realities. And you have to remember that up until, up until recently, there have been civil wars in the region where people are fleeing, right? And so you have people who might not even have gone to college yet, but I hope, it's a sincere hope that individual readers, potential students or people who are just going to the library to try to understand the world around them, to try to make sense of their experiences, that these people can find the knowledge on immigrants to other parts of the world empowering, and that they can use this knowledge to help them make informed decisions, both about themselves as individuals, but also about communal spaces and how they want to interact as communities. So this is again, like I mentioned, my answers are a little bit personal today, and I apologize for it, but it's really one of the hopes that I had, one of the motivations, one of the gaps that I was hoping to reach different groups of people, and that's one of the groups that's really a primary motivator for me. And you know, I think Claudia also mentioned this. We really did not expect to get so many submissions. At some point, it started to feel a little bit bad that we had to reject so many projects. And you know, the idea is that there were just so many different, well-researched, timely ideas, and we had to pick the ones that were somewhat connected to one another, or that were different enough from one another, that we could have a more holistic perspective. And I just want to say thank you. This is my first time meeting some of the authors here on this call, but I really want to say thank you to the authors. I would say thank you to Claudia, and I would say thank you for everyone for your interest, because you know, it's been a result that I'm really glad that something like this exists, and it was a little bit of trying to figure out the system as we go along, and we appreciate all of your hard work. So thank you.
Yes, I completely agree. After to check the book, I had the pleasure to check the book, and I, like as a research of the diaspora, the Arab diaspora in South America particularly, I think that work like this in terms of the broad spectrum, the fields, the different fields, I think was something that students as well as the communities themselves, they will appreciate it. In terms of listen their own history or Chile, Argentina, whatsoever, in the broad spectrum of the Arab community as well. In particular, we'll go to a particularly focused chapter with one of the authors who is a master student in candidate, sorry, in the American Cairo University, Hodor Khalil. Hodor, are you there?
I'm here.
Hello, welcome again, Professor. I will particularly was very delightful that, reading your chapter. Was a very quite interesting in the field and as well in the literature as well. For that reason, I will try to give some questions regarding to the main topics in the chapter. First is why this is the Syrian community. If you can give us a little bit of introduction, but why the Syrian conflict spark a debate in the Arab and particularly in the Syrian diaspora in Argentina, and how doesn't the humanitarian crisis enter like a broad topic in the national agenda inside of Argentina? How these two main issue was reflected and appear in your chapter?
Okay, well, first, thank you for your words, but also I want to thank to the institutions that organize this event and the sponsors. Also, I want to thank to both of the editors, Claudia and Mariam. Thank you so much for making me part of this project. Diego, it is a pleasure to share this project with you as well. Now, going back to your question, the Syrian conflict caused a renewed interest in the motherland, particularly among the Syrian component of the Argentine Arab community, and sparked a debate on the best way to address the ensuing humanitarian crisis. Now, Argentina's effort to address the Syrian refugee crisis was facilitated by the adoption of pro-immigration policies like neighboring countries. This should be highlighted too, like Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina all reacted pretty much at the same time to the Syrian refugee crisis. And in great part, this has to do with the fact that there was a big, or there is a big Arab diaspora in these countries, and part of it is of Syrian origin. Now, the most important questions were whether Syrians, refugees or not, should be relocated to Argentina. If so, which Syrians, should women or children inside Syria be given priority, or should the priority be given to Syrians already residing in refugee camps, that is outside of Syria? Also, who will pay or bear the burden or the economic burden of this relocation? So before I go a little bit deeper into this, let me give you a few information or numbers about Arab and Syrian immigration to Argentina, just to make sure that I highlight the fact that there is an Arab and a Syrian community in Argentina. So between 1857 and 1914, Argentina received a net immigration of about 3,300,000 people roughly. By 1914, the Arab migration registered under the label of Ottoman. This is because Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine, where most Arab immigrants to Argentina come from. I mean, these countries did not exist yet until the end of the Ottoman Empire. So the amount of, what I want to say is the amount of Arab immigrants to Argentina by 1914 was around 65,000, or the equivalent to 1.6% of the total Argentine population. Moreover, after receiving this, or after going through, for example, some of the foundational documents of the Argentine Arab institutions that were established throughout the 1920s, one can also trace the origins of this early Arab immigration, and those that came from Syria pretty much came from the districts of Aleppo, Atal, Al-Qutaifa, Al-Nabak, Homs, and Damascus. And when they settled in Argentina, they also replicated the same social and communal differences that we can find in Syria throughout this past centuries. So after reaching its zenith during the 1920s, Arab immigration steadily declined. However, the roots for an Argentine Arab community and a Syrian community in particular were already planted, and its fruits would lobby the Argentine government for a response to the Syrian refugee crisis after or starting in 2011. So by the time the Syrian conflict began, the leftist governments that were dominant in South America, they were akin, or their political ideology was akin to take on human rights causes or demands from low that were associated with human rights or humanitarian crisis. So this facilitated the incorporation of the Syrian refugee crisis into the public agenda. Hence, the drafting and implementation of humanitarian policies in Argentina to address the Syrian refugee crisis was not only facilitated by the fact that there was an Arab and Syrian diaspora in Argentina, but also there was a like-minded or let's say a receptive political ideology in government. Consequently, throughout my chapter, what I do is analyze further history, a little bit of what I have just done. First, what I do is I analyze the history of the Arab immigration to Argentina. Second, the representation of the Syrian conflict by Argentina's media. And last, the origins and implementations and reforms of this, what we came to know as the Syrian program, which is the actual policy that Argentina deployed starting in 2014 to address not only the Syrian conflict, but also to offer a response to the demand of the Syrian diaspora in Argentina.
Excellent. It's a lot of information there, and I think that in the chapter will be quite amazing to reach out. But regarding to the last part of your answer, there was a particular issue about the media. And I think there is an important aspect at the same, like the chapter of Dr. Versito. The media play a role there in this pressure of lobby or interaction between the Arab community and the own state. For the reason, in particular in Argentina, with this humanitarian crisis, what was the role of the media played in promoting the narrative about the Syrian conflicts and the refugee crisis? And did this impacting the policies designed or not?
Yes, thank you for your question. It's a very interesting question. And the fact is that the Syrian conflict drew the attention of the Argentine media in part thanks to a mix of the conflict's own characteristics. This, what I mean is, we have great powers involved in the Syrian conflict. Also, there was a great or a high level of violence. So this caught the attention of the Argentine media, just like much of the Western media. But also, as I said before, there was in Argentina an important Arab and Syrian diaspora that also helped in drawing attention towards the conflict. Now, the Argentine conflict, viewed it in the Argentine, or the Syrian conflict, viewed it in the Argentine media by the end of March of 2011 in a column that was published by the newspaper The Nation or La Nación, and the article was titled "Violent Repression in Syria, 15 Dead." Now, 3 weeks later, the television show TV Pública Internacional dedicated its weekly emission to a special through a special report that was titled "Crisis in Syria." Now, what I'm trying to say here is that the coverage provided by these two popular and ideologically opposite media outlets meant that the Argentine society was made aware of the ongoing Syrian conflict. Not only the Arab diaspora, but the Argentine society at large already, or at least knew that there was a conflict in Syria. Now, regardless of media politics and social awareness, the Argentine press suffer from the same bias experienced by other Western media, that is framing, personalization, dramatization, fragmentation, and authority disorder bias. Now, all these elements affected the quality of the information and that was offered to the public, and also affected the audience, the capacity of the audience to draw informed conclusions about the Syrian conflict, and also the response or the humanitarian response that was required. Let me put these concepts a little bit to work through one simple and one very known case, which is Hanin Nasser's arrival in Argentina. And I will comment a little bit on the coverage done by La Nación and Diario Civil Libanés. La Nación is a major news outlet in Argentina, usually associated with the, let's say, the liberal side of society, particularly when it comes to economics and politics. And Diario Civil Libanés is a community, Arab community newspaper or outlet. So on July 17 of 2004, La Nación opened its article about Hanin's arrival with the following sentence: Hanin Nasser, and I open quotes, Hanin Nasser is 24 years old and left her native country, the convoluted Syria, to forge a future in Argentina thanks to the help of a friend with a similar last name that she met online. End of the citation. Now, the following day, Diario Civil Libanés started its coverage saying, and I cite again, on Friday night, the Syrian Hanin Nasser, 24, stepped on Argentine ground after 7 months of endless procedures and more than 20 hours of travel to turn a new page of her life story. Now, the point, and I close the citation, and the point here is that even though La Nación and Diario Civil Libanés address different audiences and promote opposite perspectives on the Syrian conflict, they both engage in the same bias in an effort to make the news fit into a politically charged narrative. Consequently, the audience lacked, again, I insist on this, the audience lacked the quality information needed to draw conclusions and take action in the face of the Syrian conflict and the humanitarian crisis. Now, briefly, the coverage of Hanin's arrival to Argentina helped to misinform the audience about the Syrian refugee crisis by first framing Hanin's arrival within the Syrian conflict, second, personalizing the refugee crisis in Hanin, and third, dramatizing the event by focusing on Hanin's suffering, Fourth, fragmenting the refugee crisis by extracting Hanin's story from the larger context, which is the Syrian conflict and the humanitarian crisis. And last, focusing on the transition from chaos to order implied in Hanin's migration. This is just one example of many. I mean, we can find plenty of examples in Argentina that replicate this bias and this lack of quality information offered by the Argentine media. In other words, society at large was ill prepared, even though they knew that there was a conflict in Syria and they knew there was a refugee crisis. They were ill prepared to understand fully the Syrian conflict and how great this conflict was. And they were not unable also, or they didn't have the required information to confront and to respond to the refugee crisis. It was even less prepared to lobby government for an effective policy. And this applies not only to the society at large, but also to the Arab community and the Syrian in particular. Last, it left the room, this bad coverage left the room open to small, compact, and well-organized actors wishing to reform the Syrian program and curb Syrian immigration to Argentina. So, through my analysis, what you see is that the media coverage of the Syrian conflict and the ensuing humanitarian crisis did not offer quality information to the society at large, but also to government officials.
Yes, for sure. I think it's quite complex. Not just humanitarian crisis, but as well how the Arab communities digest the foreign affairs of their own countries, particularly when they need to deal with journalists, newspaper, that most of them they can't read in the original language, and they have all this kind of filter, and how they can in the end try to engage in foreign policies or in trying to take a more impact in their own states, particularly when you have so many groups. For sure, it was one of the most interesting chapter in my personal view. Sorry for this. Now I would like to, I don't want to take all the questions that I will take all my PhD colleagues and professors. I will take all the night with all my inquiries regarding to the book. For this one, I would like to turn our audience and share the speaker with the question that we receive. For those that don't have yet submit any question, please do so in the Q&A box. I have one notice for our guest Diogo Bertzito. There was two questions. I will address in just one. One was regarding to the overrepresentation. This again and again will appear, I think. Was Kashit. I don't know how to pronounce his name. Sorry again for that. They want to regarding want to understand this kind of overrepresentation. I try to understand this question regarding of if there is a feeling of overrepresented, like the Lebanese community discuss about this, or they understand like a normal process, like we are engaged with domestic politics and that is normal, everyone does it, or they think that maybe they feel special regarding to that. I don't know. And the other one is regarding to, well, this is more broad, but if the Arab culture affects the culture of Brazil, that was for a PhD another PhD thesis regarding to music, food, accent, or another thing. And the second question, if you want, you can address the first, I think is more related to your work. Professor, please.
Right. I actually love the second question, but let me get to the first one first. Perhaps it's just, perhaps I didn't choose my words well, but what I meant by overrepresentation is just taking the amount of Lebanese and descendants in Brazil. We would expect perhaps them not to have so much influence in politics. I think that's what I'm trying to say. And that comes from the time that I was working as a journalist before being a scholar. Because I was writing all these stories about, I was living in Lebanon for a while, so I was visiting the villages and kind of writing these stories about the places where our politicians came from. And I just started to get very curious personally on how was that Brazil had so many politicians of Lebanese descent, which doesn't happen in other ethnic groups, like say the Japanese migrants or German migrants. We had Spanish migrants. They don't have the same kind of overrepresentation. That's what I mean. I hope it's clear for the person that asked. But regarding influence on culture, I think it's a fascinating issue. I don't know how much people outside of Brazil know, but for instance, Arab food is as widespread in Brazil as to being part of, well, let me rephrase that. I would eat, as a Brazilian, I would eat kibbeh and sfiha and kibbeneye and tabbouleh as if it was Brazilian food. I mean, it's never portrayed as Arab food. It's just food. You just have sfiha every day, and that's kind of what you do in Brazil. So it's that common. That's how widespread it is in Brazil. Yeah, there's a lot of influence on music. There are a lot of musicians also from Arab descent. We had a lot of musicians migrating to Brazil as well. There's this very famous Lebanese artist, Najib Hankash, who lived in Brazil. Actually, one of our deputies now, Jandira Ferrali, she's the niece of Sabah, who was one of the main, Lebanese singers. So we actually have a lot of influence on music as well. I wouldn't say we have influence on accents per se, but of course the vocabulary, same as Spanish, derives a lot from Arabic. But we also have very, very specific expressions, I guess, because we had some soap operas in Brazil with main characters from Arab extraction. So there's a lot of inshallah and a lot of, mashallah and a lot of Quranic expressions as well that got popularized in Brazil in the last 2 decades. So yeah, that's a huge, as Jorge said, it's an issue for, a whole PhD dissertation.
Sorry, can I add to that if that's okay?
Yes, for sure, Professor.
Sure, I checked the chapter just to make sure how I understood it. I guess maybe it was a little bit different, but if it's okay, I'm going to, and Diego, you're here, you're the author, you can feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But basically the calculation was that, there was no official, there was like no official count of how many people are of Arab descent, but that it might be somewhere between 3.3 to 4.7% was the calculation. And in relation to that, the number of politicians is close to like 10% in some years. And so I think like overrepresentation sounds awkward when we're using it kind of without this evidence, without this data, but the overpopulation just refers to the mismatch in the percentages. I think that's, I just wanted to add that. And Diego, is that right? Can you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. You said it much better than me. Yeah, that's what I meant. It's kind of out of proportion. Perhaps there is a language barrier, maybe I misrepresented it, but that's exactly what Marian said. It's just the percentage doesn't match. I think that's a better way of putting it.
Yeah, particularly because as well in Chile, we have the not official census. We have 500,000 of Palestinians living in Chile, one of the largest community outside to MENA country. But as well is how we know this, and particularly when you ask to the how you know that you are Palestinian. You don't have a Palestinian name. You don't have surnames. You know that from 1880, your family come, but most of them don't have any papers. They don't speak the language, but they feel and they act and they represent the Palestinian issue very, very hard. And that is the thing that I think the book addresses as well. In the diaspora, in the Magyar diaspora, these kind of different layers. And with this narrative of the community itself, the media outlets that they are surrounded, and as well the certain thing that we don't know but is there, and we need to study and we need to highlight it because they are important not just for the communities itself. It's part of the South American history. Diaspora, Arab diaspora is not foreigners, it's part of our history, the construction and the building of our nationality and our history like an state itself. They are not foreigners anymore. Are part of our own history. I speak like a Chilean as well. And for that reason, I think, and I highly recommend this book because you will find and you will lose between all the information, and maybe you will find yourself as well in some of the pages in this beautiful recollection. I will just ask a very bad question, very nasty question. We will see a second edition of this? Someone wants to lose more nights working maybe for a second edition.
We would love to see that. Miriam and I were talking about this. I mean, the entire book we can have volumes for Arab diaspora in each continent on its own. You know what I mean? It's like the subject is so rich that would be amazing to see. One thing that we didn't capture, as Miriam pointed out earlier, are migration patterns to Africa. I mean, that would be amazing. Unfortunately, we couldn't capture that in this volume, but we hope that this sparks the interest of other people and maybe us at some point. We don't know.
Professor Mariam?
Yeah, my answer is definitely not in the next year. So this is actually my second book, and after the first one, I promised my friends I'd never do a second one, but it happened, and so I guess you know, for me, honestly, like even listening to this conversation, what's really cool is like it just came to me, this idea that what we call al-mahjar, you're calling mahyar, right? So like even linguistically, like Arab words sound differently in different cultures. Even that would be really interesting to get like a linguist to write something and to like help explain cultural translation, or you know, there's this like field of linguistics that deals with social movements, and I mean, you know, it's who knows what the future brings, and honestly, Claudia and I keep joking about wanting to visit some of these countries, so it'd be really cool to actually do research from a location rather than you know, emailing folks at odd hours in the day and night, and you know, so I really don't know. I don't have a direct answer. I know that Claudia and I had a great experience working together. You know, there were good days and there were bad days. She was in Beirut when there was the blast in the past year, and so but in general though, yeah, I think only time will tell. But thank you for that question.
Yes, for sure. I think that publishing an editorial can take in 1 year more this challenge. From Istanbul, this is my last words. I will very thank for your time, for your answers, and for the insightful of this book that I really recommend. And I check it, and it's a wonderful piece of work. It's really wonderful. I will just leave the last words to Marcelo, please.
Yeah.
Marlene?
What can I say? What can I say? I think I just need to say many thanks for all for attending this passionate debate. I hope you enjoyed, like me, this meeting. I would like to especially congratulate the editors and authors. For sure, it's a very important contribution to deconstruct the stereotypes and try to build a real dialogue and a real understanding about the Arab world. But Marian and Claudia, forget completely your promise. We're waiting for the next book, and we're waiting also for present the next book and this foundation with this amazing group. If you have more questions about our program and what you do, you can just visit our webpage. It's photosur.com.r, and that's it. We're waiting for you for the next event. Thank you very much for being part of this beautifully amazing journey. Thank you very much. See you. Thank you. Bye.